Welcome to UO Today. I'm Barbara Altman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest today is Daniel F. Becker, Director of the Safe Climate Campaign, an advocacy group he launched in 2008 that aims to slash greenhouse gas emissions. Between 1989 and 2007, Becker was the director of the Sierra Club's Global Warming Program. He developed and implemented advocacy and media strategies for Sierra Club grassroots volunteers, national and regional staff, and federal decision makers. In 1994, President Bill Clinton appointed Becker to the Presidential Advisory Committee on Personal Motor Vehicle Greenhouse Gas Reductions. Prior to joining the Sierra Club in 1989, Becker was the Legislative Counsel for Environmental Action, where he helped win passage of the federal Superfund law to clean up toxic waste and worked to pass a strengthened Clean Air Act. Automotive News, Detroit's trade magazine, named Becker to its list of top 10 Washington players who most affect the auto industry. Rolling Stone magazine and Salon.com have named Becker one of the world's 28 climate heroes, along with Tony Blair, Al Gore, and James Hansen. On November 1st, 2010, Becker gave a talk at the U of O entitled Cars and Climate Change: How We Can Help Cut Global Warming Pollution Through New Fuel Efficiency Standards. Becker's visit was in conjunction with a fall term class entitled Car Cultures, developed by English and folklore professor Gordon Sayer, with the support of the Oregon Humanities Center's 2010-11 Coleman-Guiteau Professorship in the Humanities. Dan, that's plenty of intro. Welcome to UO Today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
We're really happy that you were able to take the time between class and lecture today to stop and talk to this even broader audience. I'd like to ask you to step way back, and if you remember back that far, and tell us how you became involved in environmental advocacy in the first place.
Well, as a kid, I was interested in the environment because I grew up in New York City in the 1960s when there was a lot of air pollution. And my eyes stung, and it was hard to breathe sometimes. And I got very sensitized to it, not realizing that it was an environmental issue. But then after law school, I went to work for an environmental group in Boston called MassPIRG, and worked on a series of issues there. And then Environmental Action whisked me down to Washington to work on toxic waste issues and help pass Superfund. And then the Sierra Club called in 1989 and said, we're trying to figure out what to do about global warming. Why don't you come over and try to lead that? So it's been a long and difficult but fun journey. And I've gotten to work on some of the best issues around and some of the scariest issues around at a time when environmental issues were very tough, very difficult fights.
You said were. They still are, I imagine. This is something that's very much still on the forefront.
And likely to get more so in the coming years. We've won the easy victories. The Clean Air Act was an enormous battle, and it's dramatically cleaned up the nation's air. The Clean Water Act, which I have not worked on, has dramatically cleaned up the water. But those were big wins. Climate change, global warming is probably the most difficult issue I've ever worked on, and it's very tough.
You use, in some of your writings, you use the term climate denialism, which I'm assuming is shorthand for the element that still denies that there's actually a global warming effect. Is that correct?
Yeah, there are, the United Nations pulled together the world's leading climate scientists from around the world and basically said, look, you guys do a survey of the literature, analyze what we know and what we don't know, and report to us every few years. The industry, the auto industry, coal, utility, et cetera, thought up a very clever strategy, which was to first deny that the problem even existed and to doubt the science. And because scientists inherently are their own best doubters, they tend to say, well, here's what we know to a certain degree, but we're not certain, and here are all the things we don't know. And my dad was a scientist, and I couldn't get him to say that he was certain that the sun would rise tomorrow morning. He said it's highly likely. So when the scientists of the IPCC, the UN body, say that they are certain that the Earth is warming due to global warming, that they are certain that human activities are contributing to that warming, and that it will lead to serious consequences, that's pretty dramatic. The industry continues to fund doubters, dissenters, deniers. Some of these people are untrained, and there's a group in Bend, Oregon, for example, that just says everything out there is a lie. There are certain politicians who've called global warming a communist plot and worse. And there are politicians who say that the scientists are actually out for themselves, that if they create this issue of global warming, then somehow they will be able to apply for grants and will be able to then report on it to scientific bodies. The reality is that the phenomenon of global warming is well established. It's good science. Svante Arrhenius, 100 and something years ago, theorized the problem of increasing CO2 emissions. And we've actually seen that as the emissions have built up in the atmosphere, the temperature on Earth is rising. And more importantly, the weather extremes have increased. So it's not just that the average temperature will be a few degrees warmer than it used to be, it's that the storms will be more severe, the hurricanes, that the heat waves, the droughts will be longer and more severe. And those are real problems. The polluters who have funded this denial industry, Time magazine ran a story on, or maybe it was Newsweek, just in the last year on the deniers. And they're very well funded. I actually know some of them. Pat Michaels from Virginia is actually an awfully nice guy. He's just totally wrong. And I'm not a scientist, but the scientists who are world recognized have said this is a very serious problem. We need to take action, and the major action that we need to take is to reduce the emissions that cause global warming, that are building up in the atmosphere and trapping the sun's radiation when it comes toward Earth in essentially a thermal blanket around the planet. And that heat-trapping gas is the problem. So yes, the deniers are out there. Yes, they are fomenting confusion and obfuscation, and people need to see through it.
In answer to my first question, you outlined the various steps that you've already taken in working with different organizations and working with the administration. Since a few years ago, you founded Safe Climate Campaign. What does Safe Climate Campaign allow you to do that the other positions didn't?
I had a great time at the Sierra Club, but 18 years is a long time, and it was time to move on. What I've been able to do with the Safe Climate Campaign is take tough positions and focus in on the issues that I think are the most important. I've been very lucky to have some foundation funding that has allowed me the freedom to do that. And because I'm in a small group and not a large group, I don't have to run the gauntlet of all of the various checks that I used to have to run through. And so I'm free to be a tough advocate, criticizing when I think it's appropriate, applauding when I think it's appropriate, and no one has yelled at me before I do something, only afterward.
That's a very good explanation. Let's get back to the crux of the issues that you're working on, which is that buildup of greenhouse gases and the warming effect that results. Here on campus, you're focusing on reducing the emissions from gas-burning automobiles, and that's one of your major focuses, I believe. So what percentage of U.S. carbon emissions can be attributed to motor vehicles right now?
Roughly a third of our emissions come from transportation, a third from power plants, and a third from everything else. So we need to focus on the two-thirds that come from transportation and power plants because they're the biggest chunks. The everything else includes cement and some industry and lots of other small contributions. Agriculture is not small, but it's harder to get at. I've focused on cars because people understand cars. They know that you buy stuff and pour it into one end and it gets burned and bad stuff comes out the other end. Power plants are tougher. Most people aren't as aware of the coal that is burned to generate our electricity as they are the gasoline that's burned to move our cars. So I focused in on the cars, and there are a couple of very simple laws that if set at appropriate levels, will dramatically cut the emissions of our vehicles. 20% of the U.S. CO2, the main global warming gas, comes from the cars and light trucks, SUVs, pickups, et cetera, that are controlled by the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards, and the new EPA tailpipe standards. So that's the 20% that we're going after.
I understand. It's obviously something that almost everybody can relate to, anyone who drives, anyone who is driven. What about the difference or the different issues involved in passenger cars on the one hand and heavy trucks and buses on the other?
Well, the Obama administration just last month issued the first ever standards for heavy-duty trucks. These are the freight trucks, but also the delivery vehicles, the UPS and FedEx trucks. And they required a 25% improvement in the emissions of those trucks during the next several years. That was a good first step, but the administration left half of the savings on the table. The National Academy of Sciences did a study earlier this year which showed that we could reduce those emissions by 35%. So we're hoping that the administration comes back and improves on the 20% reduction that they've just ordered by dealing with the next 15% that is doable and cost effective.
To get back to the individual passenger or driver, though, that's what you're really focused on here for your campus visit. And in your materials, I read with surprise that even with existing technology, there's a whole lot that can be done to pretty radically improve fuel efficiency, given how we already build these things. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Thank you for asking. This is auto mechanics, not rocket science. The automakers have had sitting on the shelves in Detroit and Nagoya and Stuttgart for years better technology, better engines, better transmissions, improved aerodynamic designs that can dramatically improve the emissions and the fuel economy of these vehicles. Because for every gallon of gas we consume, 28 pounds of CO2 is pumped into the atmosphere. That's 28 pounds per gallon. Each gallon that we save is a major boon to curbing global warming. It is, in fact, the biggest single step we can take to curb global warming by making our cars drink fewer gallons. So the challenge that the administration has accepted is to make further improvements on the law that was just passed in 2007 and the incremental improvement that the President ordered just a few months ago with a new set of standards that will require even more dramatic emissions reductions between 2017 and 2025 when the current standards run out. And these are simple technology changes to improve the efficiency of the engine, to improve the transmission, and the hybrid car, which is something that a lot of people see around Oregon. I've certainly enjoyed seeing a lot of them. It's just a very efficient device. Because it has a more efficient engine and an electric motor, which the engine generally recharges, you can have a more aerodynamic front end. So you get an improvement in aerodynamics because the vehicle has a smaller propulsion system. Because the engine and the motor are lighter than a standard internal combustion engine in most cases, you don't need as much fuel to propel it down the highway. So there are multiple savings beyond just the simple mechanism of a gasoline engine recharging an electric motor. We anticipate that in 2025, if these standards that the administration is considering are tough enough, that we will see roughly half of the new vehicles sold in 2025 will be hybrids. Roughly half will be much more advanced internal combustion engines, and we'll begin to see the first mass production of electric cars, maybe a few percent, maybe more. But it depends upon how tough the administration is. We've urged that they go for a 6% improvement, which would translate to about 60 miles per gallon. Now, we're talking about 2025, not a week from Thursday, so the auto companies can get there.
This is a 6% improvement per year, correct?
Yes.
Right.
We're currently, the rule that the administration announced in April requires roughly a 5% annual improvement now between 2012 and 2016. And the auto companies actually support that. We're saying extend that out to 2025, and because there will be more time for them to achieve it, move it up from 5 to 6% a year. Now, obviously, every year is another 6%, so the cumulative savings is significant. But that's why it's the biggest step we can take to cut global warming pollution.
You mentioned multiple savings in the current design of hybrids, both in the aerodynamics of them and the weight and therefore the decreased fuel costs. Are there also greater production costs over a more standard engine?
Sure. You put more technology on a vehicle, it's going to cost more. The good news is that it saves so much gas that you save more on fuel than the upfront costs add to the vehicle. And the payback time is in the first several years, depending upon how much you drive, 2 to 4 years. And then after that, it's all gravy, it's all savings. So my 10-year-old Prius is something where I'm actually cashing in every year. So it's net savings to me to have an efficient car. But obviously, yes, there's an upfront cost, but it's a pretty wise investment.
You must have been one of the very early Prius purchasers if you
I was, but if I was going to urge that other people do it, I felt I needed to do it too.
Yeah. What about somebody who says to you, what is the better economy, to buy a new and more fuel-efficient car or to continue to run my well-maintained 10-year-old car?
Well, the best choice is to not drive if you can not drive. So walking, biking, taking mass transit, that's the best thing you can do. If you have to drive, obviously get the most efficient vehicle that meets your needs. Someone who has a family of 6 is probably not going to get a 2-seater. But if you can, if that meets your needs, by all means, feel free to do it. As between a new and an old, it really depends upon the efficiency of the vehicle. If you don't buy that used vehicle, someone else will, or it will be sent to another country after it's finished its useful life in this country, usually 10 to 15 years. You've seen pictures in Latin America, for example, of lots of old American cars. Unfortunately, they don't always die here. They're transported somewhere south and continue to pollute for a long time to come. But the most important thing is how much you drive. And if you can drive less, that's great. And if you can drive a more efficient vehicle, that's good too.
How do we explain the fact that American car companies, among others, are already selling much more fuel-efficient vehicles in Europe and in Asia than they are selling here in North America?
We explain it because the Europeans and the Japanese and the Chinese are smart enough to demand that they make more efficient cars there than we've demanded that they make here. When I sometimes meet with Republicans, I like to point out that the godless communists in China have tougher fuel economy rules than the leaders of the free world. The reality is that there are differences between the U.S. and other markets. In Europe, there are a lot more diesels proportionately because they subsidize diesel fuel. And there are smaller cities and there are narrower streets, but the reality is that they are 25 to 30% more efficient than we are with roughly the same kind of lifestyle. And a lot of that is transportation. Now, yes, we need more mass transit. It's essential. And most European countries are way ahead of us, and the Japanese and the Chinese are beginning to move forward on that. But we are uniquely wedded to the car. And as I told the class earlier today, we need to change America's love affair with the car. But first, we can change the car. And it's going to take a long time to convince Americans either to drive less or give up their car entirely. In the meantime, we can make vehicles that are much more efficient and that dramatically cut the pollution and the oil addiction that go with driving.
Let's talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about the Cash for Clunkers program, a pretty recent initiative of the Obama administration. It was aimed to try to get the auto industry out of its slump, also aimed to help the individual consumer. What was the impact of it in terms of carbon emissions in the end?
The impact was modest, but interesting. We were early, well, the first proposals were for an exchange program where you brought in an old vehicle that was inefficient and purchased a new vehicle that was dramatically more efficient. The auto company said, no, no, no. We're going to narrow that gap so that you can bring in a relatively recent vehicle that is relatively efficient and still get cash subsidy from the taxpayers for buying a vehicle that is not much more efficient. And in some cases, it could be even more of a gas guzzler than the vehicle you traded in. The amazing thing was that the American people didn't do that. The American people were much smarter. And they, in general, traded in less efficient vehicles than what they bought. So the net result was slightly positive for the environment. And because these vehicles, the old clunkers, were destroyed, it meant that they don't go to another country and continue to pollute once their pollution is done here. They're not Cheshire Cat polluters.
One reason, I think, other than the broad impact of talking about individual cars, personal cars, one of the reasons behind your push, I would imagine, is that the automobile industry is a big motor in the national economy. Is that another thing that's compelling you to push ahead in this particular aspect of fighting global warming?
It is, but if what you're referring to is the production, the emissions of producing a vehicle, they're only a tiny fraction of the vehicle's own emissions. Ford Motor Company put out a report a few years ago for its shareholders, and it said that only 3% of their emissions are from production of the vehicle. 97% is out of the tailpipe of the vehicle. So yes, it would be very helpful for the industry to improve their production techniques, but the most important thing for the environment is to clean up what comes out of the tailpipe. And the best way to do that in terms of global warming, remember the 28 pounds per gallon, is to guzzle fewer gallons of gas. And it has other benefits. It saves you money at the pump, and of course it cuts the oil addiction that leads to problems like the Gulf Wars.
What I was trying to get at in a relatively inarticulate fashion there was how crucial the auto industry is to the health of the U.S. economy. So on the broader scale is a good reason to address this because we need the auto industry to drive the national economy.
Well, this is something that the industry and advocates like me have disagreed about. We have argued that to the extent that they're protected from emissions laws and fuel economy laws, they were being protected to death. And the recent bankruptcy of the industry has shown that, in fact, the John Dingles and Carl Levins of the world, the Michigan political leaders who had prevented and postponed and delayed action on cutting emissions from vehicles, did them no favors. That, in fact, the industry based in this country was unable to compete effectively with foreign manufacturers and ended up having to be bailed out to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of our money, which has not been repaid and may not be repaid in full. And also that they had to go through the cleansing of bankruptcy in order to relieve them of other responsibilities to their workers and others. The reality is that if they make efficient vehicles, if they make vehicles people want to buy that aren't bad for the environment or are a lot less bad, they will be better able to compete against the Toyota Priuses and the BYDs from China, which are coming, which are much cleaner and much more efficient vehicles.
Dan, by the time this interview airs, the November elections will be a piece of history, but at the moment we're still on the eve of those elections, and one of the most scary and interesting things that's happening is Proposition 23 in California, an attempt to roll back the suspension of, or an attempt to suspend a law curbing greenhouse gas emissions. What's your current take on that? Are you optimistic that this Prop 23 can be turned down, or where do we stand on the eve of the election?
Well, the latest polls show that the effort to repeal the major global warming law of California is going to fail, and that the people of California have seen through this outrageous campaign by two Texas oil companies and a company led by the Koch brothers, who have spent millions and millions of dollars to try to push their agenda ahead of that of the people of California. And repeal this very important global warming law. If, in fact, the people do vote that way and do keep in place the global warming law, I think it will signal that global warming denialism is severely wounded or maybe dying, because the people saw through this effort by the same people who are denying that global warming is real, the same people who are pushing to have Congress take no action on global warming and trying to prevent action in other states, that people saw through that and rejected the argument that they shouldn't take action on this very important issue. So I'm very hopeful. We'll see shortly whether the hope pans out. But irrespective of what happens in California, it is unlikely that Congress will deal in a reasonable way with global warming. And that means that it's up to states to take action when they can. And so the people of Oregon need to call out for action. Your leaders, whomever they turn out to be after the election, need to be leaders on this issue. This is a state that has been a leader on global warming issues. It was one of the states that adopted the California Clean Car Law, the Pavley Law, and helped force the federal government to change its policy of doing nothing to improve cars. So what Oregon does can be very important to the rest of the country, and you guys can take real action when maybe other states cannot. So that's a very important thing. Another is these rules that we've been talking about, the 2017 to 2025 rules. The Environmental Protection Agency is now writing those rules, and they're deciding as we speak whether they are at the 3% level that the auto industry is pushing for, or less, or the 6% level that environmentalists have been advocating, which is, again, an annual emissions reduction rate for the auto industry. And at 6% per year, we will have dramatically cleaner cars by 2025. We will begin to have the first mass production of electric and other advanced technology vehicles, and we'll enjoy the fruits of that, which are saving money at the gas pump, cutting our oil addiction, and cutting global warming pollution.
That's where we're going to have to stop on that lovely sentence. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I understand that the students will be taking you on a bike ride. They already did. You'll be out again on the bike tomorrow, enjoying the fair city of Eugene.
It was great this morning, and I'm looking forward to the next ride.
Thanks for visiting, Dan.
Thank you for having me on.
We've been speaking with Daniel F. Becker, director of the Safe Climate Campaign. On November 1st, 2010, he gave a talk at the U of O entitled Cars and Climate Change, How We Can Help Cut Global Warming Pollution Through New Fuel Efficiency Standards. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.